So, topic for today is finance and climate. I was thinking today that maybe I should explain in 1 minute why should we talk about finance in a conference about climate change and the climate crisis. I feel it's not so common to do this, at least maybe in Spain, maybe in other places it is. But my explanation, or why I think this is important and why I spend some time reading people like Benjamin and Daniela, is to some extent the climate crisis is also a problem of time and money. So how do we use our time to do the things we need to do, and how do we pay for that time and the resources needed to do that? And the problem in our world today is that time and money are controlled in a very specific way, which is, fairly complicated, where finance plays a very fundamental role. So all these issues and constant problems of, how are we going to pay for this, who's going to pay for that, the government doesn't have money, all this, in the end, it's very difficult to understand how we got here without understanding some details about finance, how it was developed historically, who are the big players, how do they control, like I said, our time, our lives, and the resources we have at our disposal to do that. So that will be my explanation of why it's important to at least have a minimum understanding of how finance works today. And to do this, we have two people who I have been reading for many years, who I think are two of the best minds in our, in the progressive camp, let's say. They are brilliant academics, but I also feel they make an effort to explain to everyone else, like, what's going on, and all these difficult topics they try to make also political interventions, let's say. So first, Daniela Gabor is professor of economics at SOAS, University of London. She has been working on finance for many, many years. She's also writing a book on the Wall Street consensus, which is coming out hopefully before the Wall Street consensus dies, or maybe not, I don't know, depends, It's good for the book if it comes before, but for everybody else it's better if it dies. And Benjamin Braun is assistant professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he teaches political economy. He works on central banking, finance, and is also writing a book about asset manager capitalism. So they will talk about for an hour or so, and then we'll, like yesterday, we'll have time for questions and debate. So, please.
Okay, good morning, buenos dias. I'm sorry I'm not speaking in Spanish. I don't want to torture you with my pronunciation of liabilities. Yes, closer? It's better? Thank you. Shall I say this again? Right, so we thought we would sort of divide our work this morning in kind of two chunks. One is to try to explain a bit what do we mean by finance and why we think finance is, thinking about finance in relationship to climate is not just a question of who pays for what, but also a question of political power and a question of where we are in what I would call late capitalism or financial capitalism. And I thought I would start with a quiz, which is it's a very strange thing to start with, but I'm sure you will see even why it's even stranger. Ben, I think I can do it. Yes. Do you recognize this building? Yes. What is it? School of Economics. No. No. It looks like the LSE, but it's not. Nobody recognizes this building? Okay, I think we should all have a bit of coffee because it's a building in Madrid. This is why I said it's a strange quiz to start. Well, not according to Google, but maybe. According to Google, this used to be a building of the Ministry of Finance, Ministerio de Hacienda, Maria de Molina 50. I have no idea where it is. I don't think I've been there. Maybe I've passed it. Why am I showing it to you? Because last year, it was sold in an auction to a group of investors led by BlackRock, which is not Blackstone. I'm sure all of you remember Blackstone. It's an infamous investor, infamous in Spain for its role in the cleaning up after the housing crisis. But this building was bought by BlackRock and Grupo Lar last year in an auction for 200 million. And this is what they promised to give Madrid. It will be transformed from a building that housed bureaucrats trying to organize the financing of the Spanish state into luxury housing in the middle of Madrid, 153 flats plus 400 bed student accommodation, right? And you think, okay, why does this matter? Why is this interesting in the story that we're going to tell you? Because this gives us already an insight. And for me, it's fascinating that the Spanish state, which is confronted with a very serious housing crisis, is still trying to resolve it through appealing to institutional investors or to financiers who are clearly not going to resolve it with this, because I'm not sure how many Madrileños can afford this kind of a building. I can promise you I can't as a public sector employee, and I'm sure most can't either. But I wanted to start with this because when we think about questions of climate, or when we think about the crisis of affordability in Europe, we have to think very carefully about the role of big finance. And I wanted to give you a sense of for BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager. It manages around $11 trillion on behalf of what we call institutional investors. For BlackRock, this building, which used to be a public building, is an asset class. Right? It's an asset class. Housing is an asset class. And I wanted to show you a picture of what housing as an asset class looks for different types of investors. In other words, how does housing become something that generates revenues for different kinds of financiers? This is from a report that we wrote with Sebastian Kohl for the Green Group in the European Parliament in 2023. And it shows a picture of the many different ways in which finance is basically very closely involved in the daily life of citizens here in Madrid, here in Spain, in Europe, and elsewhere. And if you think of housing as an asset class, or infrastructure as an asset class, renewable energy as an asset class, it's a way of saying that investors get cash flow. They get regular payments from owning that particular type of infrastructure. This is social infrastructure for them. And it can be owned. Housing can be owned as an asset class in very many different ways. And we paint a picture here. Let's see. So see, oh, sorry. I don't know what it is.
Oh yeah, here we go.
Yeah. So what you can see here, no, one of them will give me a light. So you can see here, when we talk about institutional investors, or when we talk about big finance nowadays, we think about institutional investors and institutional capital. These are pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, like Norway has a sovereign wealth fund that manages its oil wealth. We think about family offices, that is small boutique investors, asset management companies that manage the money of the super rich. Right? And then you have all sorts of asset managers, and they can become exposed, or they can get exposure to housing either by lending to those who build houses, and then they lend through, let's say, bonds there, and there are many different ways in which you can lend, or you can be exposed to housing as an asset class, but they increasingly own houses. So finance, institutional investors, they own houses. We call them in this report institutional landlords. Blackstone in Spain is a very famous institutional investor that comes and buys in bulk and then rents. And of course, when it rents, it looks for the highest cash flow possible. It looks for the highest return possible. And that has a very clear, and we'll come to this in the questions, that has very clear implications for crisis of affordability and any social infrastructure. Now, how can they become owners of housing? They can become owners of housing, for example, by setting up residential funds. These are like typically set up by private equity funds, like Blackstone. They get contributions from pension funds, and then they invest on behalf of these investors. They buy houses, they rent them out, get monthly rents, and then they send some of these monthly rents back to the ultimate owners. We have, and you will know this is, you can have residential mortgage funds, so they buy the mortgages rather than buying the houses. You can have what we in Spain are called socimis, which are owners of houses, but they are traded on the stock exchange. You can have exchange-traded funds, and you can have listed real estate companies. So you see, there are many different ways in which finance has now made housing into an asset class. And we could replace here housing with data centers. We could replace housing with renewable energy plants. We could replace housing with anything that is an asset class for institutional investors. And there is a constant expansion in financial capitalism. There is a constant push for more and more things in the everyday life to become an asset class, because I will show you in a second, there is a growing glut of this institutional capital. We have a lot of it, and it needs to find significant returns. Right, so this is just a picture of how housing is becoming increasingly part of the portfolios of institutional investors. And this happened after the 2008 crisis here in Europe, because governments who were, particularly in the euro area, who were pushed by the Troika to choose austerity, to choose fiscal austerity, use these institutional investors to clean up the banking system from delinquent mortgages. And I can tell you a long story about Blackstone. I've studied it because it's very interesting in terms of how it benefited from the support of the Spanish state to become a large owner of housing in Spain. But you can see that the same in Berlin. You can see the same sort of tendencies in London and in most large cities across Europe and increasingly across the world. So when we talk about big finance, or when we talk about finance and the relationship with climate, we no longer mean just banks. And I wanted to show you here something that we don't think enough about in Europe. But when we talk about finance, we talk about institutional capital. And these are types of institutional investors that are collecting money or that own or invest on behalf of regular citizens. And you can see in this graph here from the ECB something that is quite striking. We think that finance is a beast that comes from the US. Right? We think it's a phenomenon associated with American capitalism, particularly the dominance of these market-based asset management companies. But you see here that Europe also has its own institutional capital, and it's becoming bigger than our banking system. So European banks are not as large as institutional capital in Europe anymore. And you see here we have, and this is a very important difference, and we will come to it. The biggest difference between the US and Europe is the fact that we haven't privatized our pension funds or our pension provision to the same pace that the US has. But our investment funds that invest on behalf of the rich, that invest on behalf of pension funds, that invest on behalf of corporations are growing as big as the ones, as the banking system. So we are seeing a very rapid change, very structural, fundamental change in the way that European finance works. And it is a consequence of, to me, 40 years of neoliberalism in Europe. 40 years of neoliberalism means surrendering the social contract between the state and the citizens to financiers through the privatization of pensions, through the growing inability of the state to tax the rich and to tax multinational corporations, because this allows the concentration of capital that needs to find investment in all these strangely colored bits here. And I can, if you want, we can elaborate this in the questions, but this is, to me, if we look at the political economy of how do we get so much of the financial activity in Europe, not on the balance, on the balance sheet of the banking system, but in what we call shadow banks, it's a consequence of decisions that the state has made about welfare and about taxation. And what is fascinating to me also is that relative to the overall size of the economy, Europe has more institutional capital than the United States. When we think about the financialization of housing, when we think about institutional landlords, when we think about the power of big finance, to some extent we always think the US, we think Blackstone or BlackRock. I started my example with BlackRock, who is an American asset manager. But what we can see in this picture is Europe has significant pools of institutional capital, and this matters, you will see hopefully later, when we think about the current debates in Brussels around the savings and investment union, for example. There is this narrative after the Draghi report. We talked about the Draghi report yesterday, when Mario Draghi saw the light and he said, okay, now Europe needs industrial policy, apparently following the Spanish socialist government's pressures. Anyways, when Mario Draghi said we need industrial policy, at the same time he said, well, the problem is that Europe doesn't have the capital markets that the US has. And because it doesn't have these capital markets, we are not innovative enough. We don't generate the millions of AI companies and tech companies and, I don't know, unicorns and capital that the US generates. We need to make it easier for investors to raise money in capital markets. But I would like to show, I hope one day to meet Mario Draghi. I still respect him for not letting the Eurozone blow up. We should show, if you show him this picture, it complicates the story that Europe doesn't have the kind of finance that the US has, and this is why we are lagging behind them. I have a theory why we are lagging behind in the kind of things that are, at least in the contemporary discourse, but we are not lagging behind because our financial system is that different. It's simply not true. We are sitting on large pools of institutional capital, and the question is, what do we do about them? And although we are sitting on large pools of institutional capital, a lot of them is invested in the United States. And I'm showing you here, this is to me a fascinating graph. It's ECB data on what are called open-ended equity funds. That is funds run by private equity, basically taking money from, say, pension funds in Europe or very rich Europeans and investing in equity markets. And what you can see here is that the European equity funds have gone to the US, so they are holding US stocks a lot more than they are holding European stocks. And you see already, we're talking 2.5 trillion, and my bet is that over the next 6 months, this line will go down here. And I can take a bet with you here if you want. Any idea why? Any idea why this line has grown up so rapidly here?
AI?
AI, yes. All of this is, to me, AI stocks. So when the AI bubble is going to implode in the US, there will be a lot of suffering here in Europe as well, because our institutional capital, our financiers, who are managing money on behalf of both pension funds, insurance companies, the very rich and multinational corporations, they are very significantly exposed to the US equity market bubble in AI. Right, so this is the backstory, again, of where we are. Europe has sophisticated institutional capital. It has big pools of capital that it could invest, that it could deploy for whatever transformative purposes it wants. It doesn't deploy them at the moment because a lot of it is simply managed by American or other types of asset managers who don't have any kind of public mandate. They have a private mandate to maximize returns for investors, and maximizing returns for investors means you invest wherever you get high returns, including in US equity markets. In fact, if you're not here, you're probably going to be fired because you're missing out on a very significant equity market build-up. So what does this have to do with the story about climate? It's just I wanted to paint a picture of trillions of euros that are moving around in the European financial system, looking for high risk-adjusted returns, finding them either in Europe or in the United States, either in social infrastructure or any other kinds of infrastructure. But our problem or our question is, how do we make this, how do we make those pools of capital work for the climate transition, right? If I was in power, if I was a minister of finance or a central banker, I think my preferred choice would be a central banker because it's so much easier to do that, would be to think about if this is the current ecosystem of finance we have, how do we think about decarbonization and how do we think about finance? And in the paper that Ben and I published recently and that we are presenting today, I'm going very slowly, yeah? Good. In the paper, we say, well, we have to think in terms of regimes, and I will come to you in a second, but there are many different ways in which you can organize the relationship between the state and private finance in order to finance decarbonization. And this is what we think about, and for those of you who were here yesterday when I asked the question about capital, the paper that Ben and I wrote is to think about not how do you persuade citizens to consume less, not how do you sell a degrowth or an eco-socialism agenda to the electorate, but how do you convince capital or how do you discipline capital into your strategic climate priorities. So we are not so interested in the labor market, we are not interested in the politics, we are in the politics of the electorate, we are interested in the politics of those who hold the money in the political economy of the relationship between state and capital. And I think capital is, of course, a social relation, but it's also a set of financial institutions who have political and infrastructural power, and they can decide, if we allow them, they can decide the pace of the green transition. And typically when we think about the decarbonization challenge, we calculate some investment gap. We wanted to show you here just to give you a sense of the fact that we need trillions of euros, dollars, and other currencies in order to generate, to pay for the profound structural transformation that our economies and societies require in order to address the climate crisis. Ben and I have a debate about whether we should use these gap figures. To me, it could also be seen when you calculate gaps of trillions in the future. This is what the president of BlackRock, Larry Fink, usually does to scare governments, because he says, oh, you don't have 7 trillions, but I have 7 trillions. So I think, okay, maybe if we want to deal in trillions, this is what this is the preferred language. But there is, just to have a clear understanding that of the gigantic scale of economic transformation that is necessary, this trillion figure is quite useful, right? So when you hear Ursula von der Leyen talking about the green industrial revolution, that we don't call it, we call it something else now, I can't remember, we deleted the term green. When the European Commission says we have to mobilize private capital, and I promise you in every document that the European Commission has put out in the last 3 years, since the Biden administration announced the Inflation Reduction Act, you will find the words mobilize private capital. This is the entire logic of how do we pay for things in the euro area, because we can't agree between the Germans, the French, the Dutch, and the Italians of how to organize us fiscally for the public sector to do this. Then the European Commission says we have to mobilize private capital. When you hear these words, these are code words for saying we have to get big finance, we have to get BlackRock, Blackstone, and other large asset managers to pay for whatever we want to do. This is the keyword for me, and it basically says there are these institutional capital pools that I showed you before. They are sitting around. They would like to invest, for example, in renewable energy. They would like to invest in some great new AI European company, but the risks are too high compared to the returns, and therefore they need some kind of support from the state. And it's important to differentiate when we talk about analytically, maybe not in I won't do it at length here, but it's important to differentiate between asset owners and asset managers. So these are the people who make the decisions on behalf of asset owners. So Blackstone is an asset manager, BlackRock is an asset manager. And this is important when we think about regulation, because when we tried to regulate asset managers in 2014, 2015, as globally systemic financial institutions, Larry Fink said,
but we are not responsible for anything. We are only responding to what the, I don't know, public pension fund in the Netherlands is telling me what to do. I have no the decisions of my own. If you want to regulate somebody, go regulate the pension funds, but don't regulate me. And this distinction is quite important when we think about the political power of asset managers and of financiers. Their problem, of course, is, and this is when they say we have trillions, their problem is that they require stable, predictable returns year after year. This is why I showed you housing as an asset class is a great example of an asset that generates stable, predictable returns, because, you know, humans don't want to be kicked out of their homes. They will do everything they can to pay their mortgages and to pay their rents. So housing is a perfect asset class in that sense, because it generates stable, predictable returns, and you can hike those rents quite easily, simply because, you know, where else to go. So, with this in mind, we also know that a lot of these institutional investors, they would like to take, even if they have, you know, because sometimes I meet people who work in the institutional investor side, and you know that they are not evil people. They're just regular humans like you and me, and what they sometimes really are environmentally minded, but they have regulatory restrictions or fiduciary duties. So they typically say we don't get enough returns given the risks that this investment generates, right? This is very important in the story, and you will see, for example, in the UK now, the Labour government, who is very fiscally conservative, is trying to get national pension funds or local pension funds to invest more in the climate transition, because that's a way of trying to square the circle of not enough public money, but there are pools of private institutional capital. So, this is a decarbonization challenge, right? Is how do we pay for things, and who pays for them, and what is the relationship between state and capital there? And in order to think about how do we organize, or how do we answer the question, this is a political economy question. It doesn't have a straightforward economics answer. You can't answer it in one objective way. You have to make political choices about who pays for what, in what way, and in what relationship between state and private capital. We think about this analytically through the concept of macrofinancial regimes, which is to say, what is the relationship between the institutions of the state that are in charge of creating or moving money around the economy, that is the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance, who is responsible for fiscal spending and fiscal revenues, the central bank, who is responsible for creating public money, and then the institutions of private credit creation are part of this regime as well. And we came up with 3 different ways in which you could organize decarbonization and the credit flows for it, and we call it carbon shock therapy, de-risking, and the big green state. Right? And I'm going to take you very quickly through carbon shock therapy and de-risking, and then Ben will talk about the big green state, which is, I'm hoping, if my book comes out, when the financier-led world has collapsed. It has collapsed because the big green state has taken over, and it's going to give us a nice publicly funded life. Right, very quickly. There is a way of organizing this in terms of how much the way in which we move across these regimes depends on how much public spending there is involved, that is, how much fiscal room there is, and fiscal room is always a political choice, and then what kind of, who exercises discipline over private capital, because private capital both has the trillions to invest, but is also very important in generating the climate crisis, because if BlackRock, for example, buys a lot of Shell bonds, it's basically financing fossil fuel extraction. Very quickly. So when we think about these 2 coordinates, who disciplines and how much public money there is in it, we have different kinds of regimes under which decarbonization can happen. The first one is shock therapy, but carbon shock therapy, it comes from the experience of shock therapy that I grew up with in Romania under the IMF programs is basically the market is allowed to do whatever it wants, and price signals are going to drive or not decarbonization. And you will see de-risking is the idea that the state has to subsidize, give some carrots to private finance in order to invest in certain projects. So let me just very quickly take you through what do we mean by carbon shock therapy. It's when, think about Russian invasion of Ukraine, fossil fuel prices go up. The state here, and Germany for us is a perfect example of that. It's the most short-sighted approach to decarbonization in some ways. When fossil fuel prices or carbon prices go up, either because there is an external shock or because politicians have suddenly decided to put carbon prices up to a meaningful level, then the market signal or market discipline kicks in, and private companies and private capital has to respond to these signals either by adapting or by closing down. So if you think about the rapid industrialization of the German economy, it's because the German government said, okay, this is a market signal, prices are higher, survive guys. If you don't survive, this is how capitalism works. We are not going to be there to help you. So you get carbon shock therapy where decarbonization happens through market forces. It's very disorderly, and we see now that geopolitically it's very, very complicated as well when other countries don't do carbon shock therapy. I'm going to skip some of that. We can discuss more if you want about the particular predicament of the German economy. I think in Spain maybe that's more interesting than in other places. I'm going to finish with this. De-risking is the preferred and has been since 2015 in Europe, since the Juncker Commission announced a new turn towards green capitalism. It has been the preferred macrofinancial regime for decarbonization in Europe, where basically the state gives some subsidies to private investors in order to invest in, I don't know, a renewable energy plant, now in data centers. It's a way of increasing the returns for these investors to mobilize private capital. And it can be either, and we make a distinction there, whether the state is only giving carrots to private investors, to big finance for infrastructure projects, or we show in the case of the Biden administration, this was extended to industrial policy. So you had industrial policy where the American state gave gigantic tax credits to private industrial capital in order to incentivize, I don't know, investment in battery factories in the United States. Ben.
Right. All right. This was not a good idea. It's coming back, yes. All right, so as Daniela said, we have this distinction between weak and robust de-risking. Robust is a more direct targeting of industrial capital. We also make a distinction between. We also pay some attention to the coalitions among state managers that support these different forms of green macro-financial regimes. And in Europe, one important reason why we have stuck to weak de-risking is the dominance, the hegemony of fiscal hawks in Europe, ever since, of course, I mean, basically Maastricht after the financial crisis and so on. Whereas the shift towards robust de-risking under the Biden administration had something to do with a coalition between geopolitical hawks and, let's say, the more ambitious green planners in the Democratic Party against fiscal hawks. So the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, was a move away from fiscal austerity. They put a lot of money on the table, which allowed a massive increase in public spending on green investment. Now, we are the Bidenomics was in some ways ambitious. also should acknowledge, of course, that there was an expansion of fossil fuel extraction. So as a climate policy, it was more than ambiguous, but as green industrial policy, it was ambitious. Nevertheless, we want to emphasize the fault lines of both types of de-risking regimes, and I think these fault lines are more or less the same for these two regimes. So one thing to note is that on its own terms, the Inflation Reduction Act kind of worked. So here you see Europe and the US quarterly real investments in battery manufacturing in billions of US dollars. The IRA is passed into law, that's the vertical line, and you see a massive increase of battery investment in the US and a very moderate, by comparison, increase in Europe. So this type of green and clean tech investment boom was very much accelerated by the IRA. However, there is still what we call coordination failure, and there is distributional failure, and both have something to do, in our view, with the fact that no one talks about Bidenomics much anymore. When have you last heard of Biden? He's gone. So coordination failure. We can distinguish between macroeconomic policy and the problem of discipline. One is that in order to combat inflation, the de-risking regime operates very much under the institutional status quo. There is no attempt to alter the relationship between monetary policy and fiscal policy, between the central bank and the government. There has been no attempt to fundamentally change the way central banks deal with inflation. So when there was a massive supply shock after the COVID-19 or during the COVID-19 pandemic, what central banks did everywhere is they massively raised interest rates, because that's the time-honored way of dealing with inflation, no matter where the shock comes from or what kind of shock we're dealing with. This was not a wage-driven inflation, obviously. It was a supply-side-driven price shock. What central banks did by doing that is they re-risked investment, because they massively increased the cost of capital and therefore the cost of investment, which, as I will show you in a minute, was particularly harmful to capital-intensive renewable energy sectors. So there's a macroeconomic coordination failure, and then there is also the problem that under the de-risking regimes, coordination at the economy-wide level still happens through the decisions primarily of private investors, industrial or manufacturing companies and financial sector actors. And there's very limited capacity on the part of the state to really direct investment beyond saying, okay, we want more electric vehicles and we want more battery production. And one example is that we think is quite instructive, is that EV production has been subsidized big time, but this has meant, to an astonishing degree, the reproduction of the structure of the car market from the internal combustion engine age, which is, SUVs, large, gigantic cars are the most profitable ones, and this doesn't change even when you build EVs. So that's what car manufacturers build in the US and elsewhere. And lots of the climate, let's say, advantage of EVs are left on the table if you just continue building EVs. So a lack of discipline in car manufacturers into building small cars is another coordination failure. Quickly on the problem of re-risking investment by raising interest rates, a coordination failure in macroeconomic policy that hit pretty much everyone in Europe and the US and beyond. Here you see the long-term real risk-free interest rate on the vertical axis in China, the Eurozone, and the US. They more or less, US and Eurozone are highly correlated. In China, it moves differently. The first area here is before the financial crisis. Then you have the zero interest rate area with even negative real interest rates in the US and the Eurozone. And then you have this massive increase in real interest rates during the hiking cycle of 2022 to 2024, which is in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, pretty much an unprecedented shock to the cost of capital. And this was clear in real time as central banks were raising rates at record speed, that this would be a big shock. And here you see what this did to the levelized cost of electricity. Anyone who has read Brett Christopher's book knows all about levelized cost of electricity. The key thing is that this is the cost, basically, of producing electricity over the lifetime of the project, and it takes into account the distribution of these investment costs across time is different for renewable energy because it's very much upfront capital cost to build a solar energy park or a wind energy park. It's very expensive at the beginning and then very cheap thereafter. But that means you need to borrow a lot of money early on in the project, spend it on building the thing, and then your returns are over the next 30 years. Okay, so interest rates are much more important for renewables. And what you can see is that so you have offshore wind, onshore wind, utility solar, and then gas. The three columns on the right are gas, and what you can see is that the change in the levelized cost of electricity of a 2 percentage point increase in the risk-free interest rate pushes up the levelized cost of electricity by 20% for renewables, or in this chart here by 5 percentage points. So this is particularly dramatic for the most expensive forms, which is offshore wind. But you can see that you can see by 20%. This is up 20% for wind and solar, and the shock to the cost of capital was relatively lower for these other forms of energy. So this was, in a way, our regime of managing inflation sabotaged the energy transition to a very significant extent. Okay, then there is distributional failure, which is a different type of failure. There was just a big election win for Democrats in New York, but also in New Jersey, in Virginia, and all of these candidates campaigned on the cost of living. The cost of living increases have not been addressed in the US, nor, I would say, in the UK. Then in various EU countries, the story is more nuanced, but there is a real cost of living crisis in the US. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which created, as you saw, a real boom in corporate investment in green tech and clean energy, did not translate into, making ordinary people better off. The Democrats lost the election to a significant extent because of the disjuncture between a massive corporate investment program and the absence of observable improvements to the standard of living for normal people. And one way of showing that is that the the usual Piketty numbers, net personal wealth of the top 1% in red versus the middle 40% in blue. Let's say, falling share of the middle 40% and the rising share of the top 1% has continued pretty much unabated, with the exception of the short blip here after the financial crisis. We don't have the latest couple of years in there, but the point is that this line, the red line, has not been brought down, and the blue line has not been brought up by the Inflation Reduction Act, or this form of green macro financial regime. All right, I think we have about maybe
15.
Oh yeah, we don't even need that, I think. Maybe 10. So what is the big green state? If you recall, we have this typology of green macro financial regimes, which distinguishes between the scale of public spending on the left side, which can be low or high, robust de-risking a la Inflation Reduction Act already was pretty significant public spending, high public spending, but it was a low discipline regime, okay? Little discipline was exercised by the state on private capital. You could still build SUVs if you wanted. You could still keep most of the profits. Inequality was still increasing, and so on. The big green state is a big public spending regime, but also a high discipline regime. Carbon shock therapy is also a high discipline regime. However, discipline there comes from and through the market, through market competition. If you cannot compete anymore, you're out. You go bankrupt as a private company. You're disciplined by financial markets. The survival constraint hits you. You can no longer get credit from the banks. You're out of business. Whereas with the big green state, the whole point is to take the power to direct investment, to grant loans and to take away loans, to take that power away from private financiers and to claim it for the state. However, that means that you also have to do the other part of the job, which is to discipline private firms. And that we have not seen in the West. And that's what we call a big green state. So here, the coordination of investment is achieved through state-led planning in one form or another, and we don't go into the details on planning in this paper, but state-led planning is a key feature of the big green state. The fiscal monetary architecture has to be reformed. You cannot have another episode like we had in 2022 to 2024. Fiscal monetary coordination is necessary in order to, on the one hand, lower the cost of capital for the state, take away any self-imposed constraints on your fiscal space. And it's also necessary in order to find better ways of managing the business cycle, of managing inflation, as we've seen. So industrial policy needs to do both. It needs to offer carrots, but also wield the stick. This can happen through both the state and the market. You know, there can still be competition. China fulfills many of the criteria of a big green state, except, of course, that it still has been ramping up fossil fuel energy production until at least very, very recently. Coal may have peaked as of this year, or so we hope. Let's see. But the key is that in China you have both state-imposed discipline and fierce competition among state-owned and private firms in the different sectors. For example, you know, there's currently a Darwinian struggle for survival happening in the car industry in China. So you can have both forms of discipline. The key is you also have the state. Control over credit is absolutely key for us. So there needs to be a significant degree of financial suppression. So one question is, what do you do with pension funds? The single most powerful constituency against, reining in finance and reducing the ability of financial actors to, let's say, capture the social infrastructure for privatized returns. The biggest political opponent in the US, in the UK, in the Netherlands, and other Nordic countries that have large pension funds is usually the pension system where it is privatized. So you need to think very hard about pension funds in these countries. Okay. That was the most important part. We can talk a little bit about China, maybe in the Q&A. I already said most of what's on here. The success of this form of big green state, green industrial policy is undeniable. One thing that we would emphasize is that a lot of the political economy problems that we describe don't go away once you build a big green state. Okay, there is still the problem of stranding assets. There is still the problem of millions of workers working in industries that are on the bad side, okay, of planetary history, in that, if you will, in fossil fuel heavy or exposed sectors. None of these problems, there's still the problem at the beginning, at least, of this transformation, macro-financial transformation, that you have pension funds with all these assets invested and payments to pensioners that are linked to returns from those investments. So none of this goes away easily, and you have to very gradually overcome these political economy constraints. But we think that the big green state is better able to deal with these challenges. To conclude, we're not calling for a green technocracy, quite the contrary. We think that the green transformation requires, as we showed you at the very beginning, massive transformative investments. And the only way, in our view, to do those in a democratic way is to have a big green state in charge of coordination, because it's much more likely to do this in a democratic way through the state that in Europe is still democratically run, than through the market, which is not democratically run. So nice quote by Aaron Benanath. We want investment to be politically negotiated in an open and contentious way. This requires the capacity for non-market coordination. Then you may ask, what is the point of thinking about a big green state regime when that is so far from current reality? Maybe an important question to ask in this room, where we think about climate policy in a political way and more broadly, not just with respect to finance. For us, an important reason to think in this way is that to show that really ambitious climate policy has not yet been attempted. And we want to spell out the macro-financial conditions for an alternative, for really ambitious climate change mitigation policy. And then also to help identify what social movement scholars and activists have called non-reformist reforms, also in other fields. So reforms that, chip away at the old and at the same time create the new. And in our case, that would be reforms that really significantly increase fiscal capacity, that significantly increase the capacity for state actors to enforce discipline on private capital, such as, for example, bringing back onto the private public balance sheet or into the realm of public democratic power, pension funds. All reforms to European fiscal rules are also in this category, of course, and so on. Thank you.
Claro, empieza...
Hola, hola. Sí, vale, se oye. Vamos a hacer como ayer, si queréis. Recopilamos 3 preguntas más o menos y las pasamos al público. Vale, tenemos una por... O sea, las pasamos a los ponentes. 1, 2 y 3 tenemos por ahí. Vale.
Hello, good morning. I'm Anahita. I came from Portugal, and I would like to ask if you think about the investment or capital from the cooperatives in this equation. Thank you. I came from an energy cooperative, so makes sense.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation. And the question had to do with where is the big state in the EU, right? So is it at the national level? Is it at the EU level? And in particular, EU finance, right? So an emission of Eurobonds, I'm sure you're familiar with the Blanchard and Angelubida piece that came out like half a year ago. There's talk about whether it would be a good time to have another emission of Eurobonds inspired in, for example, the anti-COVID package, right? And presumably, it would be easy to do that in the current context in terms of like demand for a safe financial asset that is emitted at the EU level. Where does that fit into your vision of sort of a big green state? Thank you.
It's okay.
Sí,
Bueno, puedo contestar yo.
It's fine, I understand.
sí, son 3 preguntas. Una es para ambos. ¿Cómo valoráis el salto, el cambio de política económica europea desde los halcones financieros, de la austeridad, a todo el tema de la financiación, pidiendo a los mercados deuda para poner en marcha todas las políticas nuevas que ha habido? Es decir, ¿consideráis que no se puede ir más lejos por parte de los Estados, por parte de la Unión Europea, pidiendo prestado y llevándolo a misiones concretas de transición ecológica? Eso es una pregunta para ambos. Y luego 2 preguntas para Daniela. Y es que has dicho en un momento determinado que la teoría del retraso de la Unión Europea, que tú tenías una opinión diferente, que no hay una teoría, no hay un retraso en la Unión Europea en el tema de las políticas de cambio climático. Y luego también es otra pregunta muy curiosa, es que habéis puesto de manifiesto el crecimiento de los inversores institucionales fuera del sistema bancario controlado por el Banco Central Europeo, pero luego tú has dicho, ahora a mí me gustaría trabajar mejor en el Banco Central Europeo. Es algo que me sorprende, porque si hay que controlar todo lo que está fuera de lo que controla el Banco Central Europeo, pues...
Okay. Maybe let me start with the energy cooperatives and with cooperatives in general. Oh, es cierto, perdón. I think, I mean, in general, my view is from studying big finance is that small finance is beautiful and cooperatives are a beautiful form of small finance. And there are important initiatives, I think, at local level. Our analysis is trying to make an argument that the local is not enough. That in order to think about large-scale systemic transformations of economic structures and, in a sense, social structures, because the social structures need to change in some ways for the climate crisis, then you need to go to the big institutions of the state, and you need to go against the political power of big finance. So I mean, it would be nice if we all just lived in small cooperatives, but that is the end goal. To get there, we have to get over the obstacles, the political obstacles that we described. I'm quite curious to have a conversation with you about what the future looks like when. If China is keeping up with the scale of innovation in small clean tech,
to the extent that we can all become our own sort of energy producers. I have solar panels on my house. I am so excited about them. I never thought I would be excited about energy, but I am. Just by simply understanding how much you can get from the sun and how you can optimize your consumption. I'm guessing that it's a form of involvement of citizens in energy politics through cooperatives if we become small-scale producers. I have some reflections on that, but again, my problem is always if we don't talk about, in terms of politics, if we don't talk about the state, the right will occupy it, and when the right occupies the state, then the small local politics disappears in these very big changes. Where is the big green state? And then maybe we usually do this, but we didn't in this presentation. I like to talk about the European Central Bank because, in a kind of counterintuitive way, because we, particularly in periphery Europe, I don't know what the feeling in this room is about the Banco Centrale Europeo. I'm not sure you feel particularly friendly towards it. It used to, when it was run by Mario Draghi, it used to send, and then before by Trichet, it used to send very unpleasant letters to socialist governments saying, please do structural neoliberal reforms, otherwise I'm not going to buy you your government bonds. I think we kind of passed that moment, but in the paper and in general, we show that the ECB has in many ways been one of the most radical state institutions in terms of climate policy. What do I mean by this? If you remember 2015, and you'll stop me, but if you remember 2015 was a terrible year in European politics. You know, we had the defeat of the Greek attempt to change the euro area macro-financial politics. We were in a fiscal austerity mode. We were in a downside in terms of economic growth. It was just a general sense of gloom. And then Jean-Claude Juncker, who came and became the president of the European Commission, said, it's time to change. We will do green capitalism now. And he started doing a project of green capitalism that was supposed to kind of move us away from austerity into a new era. And this attempt, and I mean, I don't think we think about it enough anymore because things have changed so much from a decade ago. But that initiative of the European Commission first gave us the sustainable finance taxonomy, which we didn't talk about here. But it was an important, to me, one of the very few moments in recent European history when European politicians and European bureaucrats in Brussels said, we will discipline financial capital. We will discipline financial capital. We used to have these debates around something called a Braun taxonomy, which was a way of identifying which credits were going to the planet-destructive activities. And the European Commission said, okay, we will penalize BlackRock, Blackstone, Banco Santander, whoever gives dirty credit, they will have to pay for it. Right? This was already an attempt, a march towards the big green state, in terms of building a capacity for the state to discipline capital. I don't know how many of you in this room are Marxists. If you are, then you are very skeptical about the ability of the state to discipline capital. I choose to believe that it is possible, even if it's really, really hard. The European Commission tried, it died, okay, we can give this to the Marxists. It was a quickly defeated attempt, but then the European Central Bank introduced something called the greening of the unconventional bond portfolio, which basically was another form of trying to discipline finance into giving more green credit and giving less dirty credit. So to me, when we talk about the big green state, we already have some institutions in the euro area that have built state capacity to do something that we know from the good old age of the developmental state in East Asia that is very important. Credit policy, that is, the state says, I want these sectors to receive more credit, I want these sectors to receive less credit. The European Central Bank did that. Unfortunately, was suspended as well. But this is why, in some ways, I would like to work at the European Central Bank, because if there is one winner in the post-neoliberal world after 2008, if we think about how did the state change, I think we live in an age of post-neoliberal states. that goes from doing industrial policy to doing climate policy to doing all sorts of things that we thought the neoliberal state didn't want to do, right? And it didn't want to do for ideological reasons. But if we think about who is the big winner of this post-neoliberal era, to me is the central bank. Central banks have incredible fiscal powers these days. They can tell a Greek or a Spanish or an Italian government or a French government, maybe soon, they will tell a French government, I don't want to buy your bonds, you're in trouble. This is what happened, for example, in the UK when Liz Truss wanted to have a large expansion plan, and the governor of the central bank said, I don't think so. And here is an unelected technocrat who made fiscal decisions. So if I wanted to work somewhere where I had a lot of power, I would work at the central bank. That's where the political and macro-financial power is. It's not very nice for a progressive person to recognize this reality, but it's very important to bear it in mind. The political fight is not only in the street, but it is in the places where central banks reside, and it is with the people who run central banks, because we did not build democratic systems to check in the incredible power that they have now. Central banks don't only just move interest rates, they do lots and lots of other things, particularly they buy and sell government bonds whenever they want. And that is something that it's a fiscal power that they should not have, and they exercise completely at the discretion of the governor of the central bank. So you get Andrew Bailey in the UK, who is super conservative, and you get Jerome Powell in the US, who's afraid of Donald Trump. Jerome Powell has a much more supportive fiscal stance for the American government. Andrew Bailey doesn't. That's why I would like to work for the central bank, unless we reform them, and then I would like to go and work in a planning ministry and learn how to organize economic activity, which I think is very difficult as well. Sorry, Bengo.
Yeah, I think this goes some way towards answering Jorge's question. I think about where is the big green state, right? Is it at the EU level or at the nation member state level? I think given the strange setup that we have, it's at both levels. It must be at both levels. I mean, and if I may put on my political science hat for a moment, you know, I believe that we're not going to win in the hallways of technocratic power just by convincing the technocrats with our arguments and so on. In a way, we've been trying that for years, for a decade, and there, you know, in some sense, like green or the ECB's tilting of its bond buying towards green, you know, I think that was largely the result of, attempts to push the technocrats from academia, from civil society, and so on, in this direction, and them trying to do what they could given their mandates and their constraints, but it didn't work. It was defeated. So in order to win in the hallways of macro financial power, we also need to win in the electoral arena, and that is at the national level. And we're very far from that. There is, of course, a conservative majority in the European Parliament and in many capitals. But yeah, the rules of the game, of the fiscal, macro-financial game, monetary fiscal coordination, financial regulation, they are all set at EU level. But then once they're loosened, you know, in order to loosen them, power still emanates from member states. And once they are loosened, the actual politics of then doing big green state things will also happen at the member state level. So it's unfortunately more complicated than elsewhere. Although I guess, I mean, in the US, government is always constantly divided, and you have an extreme division of power, so it's not so fundamentally different.
Sorry, if I may, I forgot to answer your
Yes,
question,
yes.
but maybe we can have a dialogue, because I am wondering whether my take is correct. So for those of you who are following, I'm following now the AI investment bubble, because I think we are approaching something called the Minsky AI moment. For those of you who remember 2008, we had the Minsky moment when, there was a buildup of speculative positions and high debt that could not be financed and became increasingly vulnerable. So if I look at the AI investment boom in the US, because I study finance, I asked the first question the person who studies finance asked themselves from like a new asset class is, who pays? Where the money comes from, where is the cash flow that is going to service all these investments? And it's not very clear to me how the AI bubble, these AI companies and the billions and soon the trillions of dollars that are going into the building both data infrastructure capacity and also, I don't know, playing around with all this. I don't know who's going to buy this. I mean, what is the monetization potential, right? So when I think about this, and then I read the European Commission, I'm not sure whether you're following or not, but there is something called an omnibus legislation going through just being negotiated as we speak, well, probably as we speak, because I think they are not sleeping throughout this period. The European Commission is preparing to drop we have something called a risk-first AI policy, which says, we don't know what this AI future looks like. We should have a more cautious approach. We can't put the future even of our productive structure, the future of our education, the future of our public sector into the hands of 7 Silicon Valley billionaires. Instead, we think about the risks and then we kind of proceed slowly. That's the European approach. And the answer from at least the right-wing European political parties is to say, this is insane. This is, again, the European bureaucrats stopping innovation. Right? So to me, it's a bet. If I'm right, and this is a bubble that will burst, then we will prove vindicated because we are not playing crazy, cowboy AI capitalism. And this is, in a sense, where the problem that the European Union has had for a very long time, that it's always tried to play cowboy capitalism that the US was kind of, innovating, first in shadow banking up to 2008, and now in AI. Should we follow them? The experience of pre-2008 says no. Are we going to, I can't understand, but this is because I'm a macroeconomist and not, an AI person. I can't understand where all these gigantic productivity improvements going to come from. Like, how is this actually going to change? If it's not going to change economic structure so much, I can see that it happens in robotics, in AI manufacturing in China, and I'm trying to understand that. But there, then, you have the very Marxist problem. If technology replaces labor, then who's going to generate revenue and from where? And we get there into a whole set of different problems. So my sense is that we in Europe always, because we are more cautious in terms of trying to make sure that capitalists don't run away and then we clean after them all the time. This is called an anti-innovation policy, my sense is no. We shouldn't put or we shouldn't allow the private capital to bet, particularly now that we are in an accelerating stage of the climate crisis. And if you look at I'm trying to understand how much consumption of the data of energy the AI the investment bubble is generating. Ben and I were discussing this yesterday, that the upward shift, like the increase in renewable energy production, kind of simultaneously happened with the AI, the investment boom. So all of a sudden we are getting cannibalized on our ability to generate better sources of energy. It's getting cannibalized by a private capital-driven investment boom that is not very clear to me how it's going to improve humankind's ability to deal with the cost of living crisis, with the climate crisis, or anything. But I don't know, maybe I'm just an AI skeptic, and if there is anybody in the room who's not, please persuade us. There is some bright techno future ahead of us. Thank you.
Vale, 3 preguntas más. Hacemos tu turno. Una por aquí, otra por aquí.
Morning, Pablo Izquierdo. Very nice talk. Thanks for that. A question for both of you. You mentioned investment funds, and of course, COP30 is kicking off just now as we speak in Belém, and there's a lot of talk around the tropical forest Forever facility, which Brazil is putting forward as an investment fund. I was wondering about your view on whether or not and how we can utilize big finance tools like that for not just carbon, not just climate, but nature conservation. And also, just following up from Daniela, on the issue of AI, I share the view that it's a bubble. I'm not so sure as to whether it's going to explode or not. So if you can elaborate a bit more on that, just to clarify. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. Here, Cristobal. I like very much the idea of the big green state. The problem is that since climate change is a global issue, maybe we need not only one big green state, but a lot of them. So what about the idea of a big green coalition? I mean, I think it's politically more difficult, but perhaps it's a kind of seed that can lead to a coalition where some rules, fiscal rules, are shared, and it may be. It's another kind of another idea of thinking. So not big green state, but big green coalition. What do you think about this idea? Thank you.
So I had kind of a point related to that final question. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on what the strategy and mechanisms of this discipline in capital would be, because every time we think about progressive macroeconomics, we get the specter of Mitterrand as policy failure and all these things. Although with Liz Truss, apparently you can't even do neoliberalism, right? But yeah, what kind of specific policies and strategies would you use to discipline capital, and how would you try to make them palatable without, this financial backlash from markets, but also perhaps even from civil society, the specter of, oh, here comes the state to expropriate all of our capital or whatever. Thank you.
All right. I'll leave the first question about COP and the Nature Fund to you. Maybe you have more. I simply don't know the answer. A quick question back to you. You were talking about a big green coalition of states, right? Or are you talking about the sub-national level?
International level, so not European level, but
international,
more international.
Yes.
On that.
Yeah. I mean, yes, of course. This is definitely something that's missing from our paper. It's very much abstract state, nation-state focused perspective, because that's where a central bank is institutionalized and where fiscal policy is made and so on. But maybe the biggest problem here is that we don't even address really the financial constraints of countries that are financially subordinated. So there is this literature about financial subordination in across the global south, but I mean in Europe we are no strangers to financial subordination, even in the euro area, especially for example in Spain. So there is the problem that even if you have political majorities in many countries, it still is very difficult to do something like a big green state if you're vulnerable to capital flight. And so then we get into this whole debate of the international monetary and financial architecture, which we're not addressing in the paper. So there is a lot of blind spots that we're aware of. But yeah, the idea would be that once you have some big green states, they could form a big green international coalition and tackle these higher level problems that prevent, countries from, for example, having fiscal ambitions that could be disciplined by the bond market. I now live in a country in the UK where this fear of the bond market, I mean, we both live there, but I just moved there, is extremely highly developed, of course, and not a day goes by without the bond market being mentioned by political actors. All right, so disciplining capital, how do you do it? This is another extremely difficult question. In the paper, we refer back to the experience of the East Asian, developmental states that did this successfully. South Korea, Taiwan, or Japan are key examples. And one thing that stands out is that you really need a lot of state capacity to do that, because it means that the state has to take decisions and enforce them about what is produced and how, and for which markets. And the famous case in Japan was the MITI, the Ministry of Industry and Technology, and then these other developmental states had equivalent institutions, and these were highly insulated, elite staffed industrial policy making institutions that sort of benefited from the fact that these were not originally actually fully formed democracies, or not democracies at all. South Korean and Taiwanese developmental states both originate in authoritarian systems. So there is a problem of translatability of that, but these lead agencies are a very important component of doing discipline. In our context, I think, the first step would be for political parties to start campaigning and, including in their platforms, things they would like to do in the economy that involve taking political decisions about economic structure and about the way we produce and what we produce. And no political party that I'm aware of would even go near this at the moment. So we're very far from that.
Okay. Yes, this is, I mean, so in the paper, we do argue that the European Central Bank is a kind of an unlikely but real place, state institution where disciplining of capital did occur, even if it was through price signals. As in, the ECB said for 9 months, while it tried to change the composition of its corporate bond portfolio, the ECB created something that we think it's very fundamental to disciplining capital, which is a mechanism or institutions for close control of corporate behavior, which is not something that the central bank typically does, right? The central bank says, what is the interest rate on the interbank money market? If it's too high, I'll go away from my policy rate, I will bring it down. Or if banks are doing something, I'm going to worry about them. But here, the ECB basically created capacity to look at the balance sheet. They had something called the climate scorecard. They had the capacity to look at the transition plans of large corporates who issue bonds, these fixed income instruments, and to say, if this climate score doesn't change, I'm going to sell your bonds. Or I'm not going to actually buy more of your bonds when I reinvest, to be very precise. So it created capacity in a sense that is very similar. I was reading about, as a nostalgic of the developmental state, I was reading about credit policy in South Korea during the 60s and 70s. And of course, having the support of the American state to do developmental, the geopolitics was right. But if you look at how they use credit policy, it's very similar to what the ECB did between 2022 and 23. They sat together every month. There were officials from the state-owned banks or the banks who were giving credit, who are doing credit policy, and officials from the in charge of industrial policy. They were sitting down with corporations every month and saying, "Show me what you're doing, and if you're not doing it right, bang, I will hit you on the hand, and you do whatever I want." Now, this is what the ECB in some ways did, is to create capacity to closely monitor what capital is doing. Now, we don't have this in the European Union for many different reasons, but I guess our purpose with this paper is to move the conversation away from, in a sense, when we do climate politics, when we think about climate politics, to move the conversation away from who's going to consume less to a conversation about the state. we cannot have a successful transformative climate policy without changing fundamentally the way in which the state works and without changing fundamentally in which state-capital relationship, the state-capital relationship is unfolding. And we can see that already because capital itself is changing that relationship, understanding and calculating that the future is going to be not very pretty, and they would like very much for the state to insulate them against a very uncertain future. So if you think about it, one way of thinking about this de-risking regime is a social contract between the state and capital at the expense of the social contract between state and citizens, because you shrink welfare for your citizens, you increase welfare for capital. So what we're saying is no, it can't be this way, although probably will be. It can't be this way, it could be another way, but the other way is to try to make people, this is the purpose of my book, it's very hard to make people fall in love with the state again. I struggle with it because I grew up in a communist state, and it was a very, very ineffective and very complicated state, and it's very hard for me to love the state, but I don't have anything else to love in climate politics but the state, so now I'm committed to loving a state that will be transformed. This is the only way that I can sell myself the idea of a big green state, is to say that if we don't love the state, the capital will completely take over. And I don't want to live in a world where capital is in charge of organizing our economic life. Now, about COP30. I don't know, it's very common. It's like, do you criticize Brazil for going the de-risking? I see de-risking everywhere because it's everywhere. You can see it in COP30. What I find fascinating is the idea of nature as an asset class. For those of you who are following the tropical forest facility, Brazil is trying to kind of bring de-risking and the big green state together in some new animal where it says we will get investors to give us money through a fund, and this money will go to local communities and hopefully to state actors, local or regional or federal. And they will take care of the forests and will invest in forests and protect the forests in ways that we cannot do on our own because we have no fiscal resources. Is this a pragmatic answer to the problems of financial subordination, to say we can't go the public way, but we will find a way of putting in the de-risking logic, making it a Trojan horse for public interests? That is a kind of generous reading, I suppose. I've been trying to understand nature as an asset class as a project for financiers, because you can find it here and there. The idea that the only way to protect nature is to make it in an asset class. Now that becomes even more complicated than the AI story, because who pays for it? Again, the only way to pay for it is basically to say the parts of nature where you can do commercial forests, you will do them because commercial forests generate cash flow. But otherwise, it's very hard unless somebody, the state again, basically subsidizes this. So I don't see it as investment funds in general. I don't see them as a way out. Yeah, they are kind of marginal solution. As for AI, whether there is, I don't know if you've seen that Friday, every large, sort of big 7 AI-related stocks, the Magnificent 7 companies have been falling. For now, it's not very clear to me what you would take, because we don't know. We know that out of the 260 billion of capital investment this year, a lot came from the profits of the large companies like Meta and Facebook, I don't know, the other one, Google and the other ones. So it's retained earnings that gets invested, but you can see already a buildup of debt. You can see it in corporate debt, there is private equity, and then there is securitization. There is an equivalent of subprime mortgage-backed securities happening now with AI bonds. If it will come from, it will come from there. I've seen that there are, besides these big 7, there are at least, I don't know, 1,000 AI unicorns who are getting very significant, who are doing very significant investments with absolutely no revenue. So who's lending to them? We don't know. It's very difficult to get the data, but we know that there is a growing kind of, I call it a soft budget constraint, trying to rescue Janos Kornai's idea about how socialism worked, right? The idea in socialism, I don't agree actually with that idea, but I think it works better in capitalism. But Janos Kornai said the problem with state planning is that you create the state-owned companies and they operate with soft budget constraints. There is no market discipline, there is no price signal. The state just gives them more and more resources, and that creates white elephants, and they all go down the drain of ineffective production processes. But if you think about the AI sector in the United States, it operates with a gigantic soft budget constraint. I mean, you actually do not function according to market logics because nobody buys your product. You cannot monetize it. It's not a capitalist, in some ways it's not, or maybe this is how capitalism works, you know, that the innovation frontier, you can operate with a soft budget constraint, while, you know, every open-ended equity fund in Europe thinks that if I don't buy these stocks, I'm going to get fired because these stocks are going up. We'll see, musical chairs, somebody will have to stop, I guess.
Vale, pues muchas gracias. Vamos a parar aquí durante aproximadamente 25 o 30 minutos. Una pausa para enamorarnos del Estado otra vez. Y, por favor, un aplauso otra vez a Daniela y Benjamín.